we're back with another tier list, and this time we're going to be doing the legendary producer, songwriter, singer, and multi-instrumentalist Todd Rundgren. And I have to say, of all of these lists that I've done so far, this is the one that I'm most excited for because Todd Rundgren is somebody whose music I didn't really explore until later in life. I had always known some of his hits, but I never really dug deeper into his discography. But when I did, I was completely blown away, and I just couldn't believe the amount of amazing stuff that I was missing out on. And I think going through his entire discography is an especially unique experience because it takes you on this journey through so many different styles, and it's really unlike just about any other artist out there, in my opinion. I mean, the amount of great music that Todd has put out and continues to put out to this day is really mind-blowing. So, as always, I'm going to go through all 26 of his studio albums, excluding Utopia and Naz. And we will start with Runt and go all the way up to White Knight. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. I'm sure there will be plenty of agreement and disagreement, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if I misspeak or say anything factually incorrect, please feel free to correct me on that as well, and I'll clear it up. And that is about it. Let's jump right into it. So we're going to start out with his debut 1970 album titled Runt, and I'm going to give this one a B. Not a bad album, but I don't usually consider this one of his stronger works, especially when you look at the stuff that comes after it. It's got some things on here that I like, as well as a few things that I'm not crazy about. I really love all of the piano-centered tracks on here, like Believe in Me, We Gotta Get You a Woman, and Once Burned, and I think the piano pop and piano ballad style is a style that Todd does exceptionally well. And a lot of that inspiration came from Todd hearing the Laura Nyro album, Eli and the 13th Confession. I also love the 3-song medley on the second to last song. Great mixture of different vibes that flow into one another in a very organic way. And I also love There Are No Words. I think that's the most unique experimental track on here, and it gives us a little taste of what's to come in future albums as Todd continues to experiment more and more with his sound. The main thing that has always bumped this album down a bit for me are the more straight-ahead rock tracks. They're not necessarily bad songs, but to me, in the grand scheme of the music that Todd has put out, those songs always tend to be the ones that I gravitate the least towards and I find the most underwhelming. I also think that the mood of this album can feel kind of scattered from time to time, but nevertheless, I think you could make a strong argument that Todd needed to make an album like this that sort of tested the waters and dipped into a couple of different sounds so he could establish a game plan for where he wanted to go in his future albums. So again, not a bad album, but not one of my favorites, so I'll give this one a B. Alright, next we continue with the 1971 release titled Runt, the Ballad of Todd Rundgren, and I'll give this one an A. Very solid album, and to me, I've always considered this to be an upgrade of the first release. It basically takes all of the elements that I really like about Runt and gives us an album with more tracks in that style. We have some absolutely beautiful piano ballads like The Ballad, Denny and Jean, Wailing Wall, A Long Time, A Long Way to Go, Be Nice to Me, and Hope I'm Around, which is my favorite track on here. Such a beautiful song. And I think even some of the more rocking songs on here are more enjoyable as well and give us more hints of the type of stuff that's to come on Something Anything, such as the opening track, Long Flowing Robe. And I love the short final track as well, Remember Me. Beautiful piano work and incredible vocal harmonies. So all in all, I think this is a great album. It has a really nice handful of tracks, and it's a significant improvement from the first album. So I'll give this one an A. Okay, now we get to the 1972 double album titled Something Anything, and it wouldn't feel right giving this anything but an S. Incredible album, and a lot of people consider this to be his best album. It's not my favorite, but it's definitely up there. This is the first album where we hear Todd completely in the driver's seat for the majority of the album, doing production and playing all of the instruments, with the exception of side 4. I love the production on this one, and I love the direction that the album takes. There's definitely a shift from the previous release, and it has a really nice blend of a couple of different things going on. So at this point, Todd had been producing a handful of albums for other groups, and it got to the point where he was comfortable financially to where he was basically able to have complete freedom over how he wanted to write, and he didn't need to worry about pumping out radio hits and really just focus more on experimenting in the studio and multi-tracking and just seeing what kind of things you can come up with. Stylistically, it's much more of a power pop sort of vibe with some psychedelic sounds starting to creep their way in, We're getting some classic hits like I Saw the Light and Hello, It's Me. We have some beautiful ballads like It Wouldn't Have Made Any Difference, Sweeter Memories, Marlene, and Torch Song. And then we have this amazing batch of power pop and psychedelic songs with tracks like It Takes Two to Tango, Breathless, The Night the Carousel Burned Down, Song of the Viking, and Couldn't I Just Tell You? I particularly think that Breathless and Song of the Viking give us some precursors of what's to come in the next release, and I think it's really cool how each album gives us little glimpses here and there of different things that are going to come in future albums, and it's amazing to see how Todd just continues to develop these styles more and more. So, absolutely amazing album. It's really mind-blowing how many good tracks he was able to pump out for a double album, too. This is easily one of my favorite double albums of all time. And yeah, this one gets an S. All right, next we have the 1973 release titled A Wizard, a True Star, and this will definitely be getting an S. Amazing album. And this one takes a much bigger leap into the trippy psychedelic realm with a much wider variety of subject matters being covered. And this was a big change considering that the majority of the first three albums consisted mostly of love songs. And this album is very far from that. Todd had said that this record was heavily influenced by his experiences with taking psychedelic drugs, and unlike the previous three albums, I would say this one is really meant to be listened to in its entirety as a full album. You have a lot of shorter 1 to 2 minute tracks, and they all blend into one another very nicely, and it follows a much less traditional form from the previous releases. And Todd said that he was deliberately trying to break free from standard formulas and cliche songwriting patterns that he felt like he was starting to fall into on Something Anything after somebody had referred to him as the male Carole King. And right from the opening track, I'm absolutely loving it with these psychedelic sounds that slowly crescendo into this really tasty keyboard and bass groove with a filter over it. And then the drums and Todd's vocals enter, and it's just such an epic introduction to this new side of Todd Rundgren. And then he does this psychedelic rendition of a song from Peter Pan titled Never Neverland. And this is actually my favorite track on the album. I can listen to this over and over and over and just never get tired of it. Something about his vocals against that beautiful piano part with the filter on top of it just sounds so sublime and so blissful. And that piano with the filter on top of it is a big part of this album and a sound that we definitely see pop up in a lot of songs on here. We're also getting some more heavily distorted guitar and bass lines and screaming distorted vocals on tracks like You Need Your Head, Rock and Roll Pussy, and Is It My Name, which is another side that we've only heard in moderation up to this point. And we also have some instrumental tracks that almost give me a video game sort of vibe with Tick 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 It Wears Off and Flamingo. I've always thought that Flamingo could be like a song from Legend of Zelda or something like that. And I also hear some tracks that almost sound like a more psychedelic version of a song that could have been on Something Anything, with tracks like You Don't Have to Camp Around and Does Anybody Love You? And we also have a beautiful ballad called I Don't Want to Tie You Down, which almost sounds like a more psychedelic version of a track that could have been on the second album. So I'm incredibly happy with the direction that this album took, and I think Todd's psychedelic years produced some of his most interesting work of his entire discography. So this one definitely gets an S. All right, next we have the 1974 release titled Todd, and this one will also get an S, another phenomenal album. And this one, to me, always sounded like a continuation or a part two to A Wizard, a True Star, in the sense that it's still very psychedelic and experimental. But one difference that I will make is, for me, this album has a lot more individual tracks that I can listen to on their own. Whereas, like I said, with A Wizard, a True Star, I always prefer to listen to the album in its entirety rather than listening to individual songs. On this album, once again, we have a very psychedelic intro with this keyboard sequence that keeps getting layered on top of one another, and then it segues beautifully into I Think You Know and opens up the album on a nice chill note with some really beautiful guitar work complementing the vocal melody. And as the album continues, we have a nice blend of psychedelic tracks, some more heavy distorted tracks like Everybody Goes to Heaven, some goofy tracks like An LP's Worth of Tunes and Lord Chancellor's Night songs. Then we have some very unique, groovy instrumental tracks like Drunken Blue Rooster and Sidewalk Cafe. And we have some great ballads as well, like A Dream Goes On Forever and Useless Begging. And he even throws in a beautiful feel-good pop song with Is That Love. The ending of the album is very strong too, with Sons of 1984. Really love the group vocals, very powerful sounding and a very epic way to end the album. So I love everything he did on here, and I think that this is just as good, if not better, than the previous album. I'm constantly torn as to which one I like more. I think it really just depends on what mood I'm in. But yeah, another amazing album, another one that gets an easy S. Okay, next we have Initiation from 1975, and I'll give this one an A. Very good album. I know some people regard this as one of their favorites, but it's never been all the way up there for me. This one takes a more progressive rock sort of sound, and there's a handful of songs on here that I really like a lot, but it also has a few that I've never been crazy about. The opening track, Real Man, is absolutely amazing and might be my favorite opening track of any Todd album up to this point, with the possible exception of Something Anything. But after that, I've always had a hard time with the next two tracks. Not sure why, but that part of the album has always lost a little bit of momentum and been slightly underwhelming to me. But the remaining three songs on side one do redeem it for me, with Eastern Intrigue, Initiation, and Fair Warning. All very good songs that are heavy on the prog sound, especially Initiation. And then side two is a very psychedelic four-movement piece called A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. Very cool succession of tracks, and I've always particularly loved the second movement, The Fire of Mind. Very cool synth sounds, and I love the instrumentation. For me, one thing that I've noticed about this album is that I do have to be in a specific kind of mood to listen to it, unlike everything else up to this point. It's not one that I can just put on at any time. But regardless, it's a very solid album, and the awesome moments greatly outweigh the dull moments, in my opinion. So I'll give this one an A. All right, next we have Faithful from 1976, and I'm going to give this one an A. Very good album. Side one consists of 6 different covers of songs released in 1966. And the philosophy behind this was very interesting. Todd had said that his intentions were to recreate the songs and have them sound as close to the originals as possible, similar to what they do with European classical music, which I thought was fascinating. And I'm sure from a production standpoint, that had to be a very fun experiment for Todd. And I think he really accomplished his goal because every cover on here just sounds spot on. But the one that really stands out to me is the cover of Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, particularly because at that point in '66, Brian Wilson's songwriting had reached a completely new level, and songs like Good Vibrations have so much crazy stuff going on within the song, and I think on this album they duplicated it pretty much as close as you can get to the original, which is really amazing. And then side 2 consists of 6 originals, and with the exception of the first and last track, I really love this side, but I've never been crazy about Black and White or Boogie's Hamburger Hell. But the remaining 4 songs are very solid and very pretty, and particularly the standout moment for me is Love for the Common Man, which is such a classic and the best track to come out of this album, in my opinion. So, like I said, solid covers and some solid originals with a couple of originals that I'm not crazy about. So, I'll give this one an A. All right, next we have Hermit of Mink Hollow from 1978. And this one easily gets an S, and I would say that this is probably my favorite Todd Rundgren album. It's hard to really definitively say because sometimes I will flip-flop depending on what mood I'm in, but pretty consistently I always end up coming back to this one, I would say, as my favorite. I love every single song on here, and this is one of the few albums where I can put it on and just play it all the way through from front to back and love every single moment of it. In my opinion, there's no filler tracks, and there's a great blend of different styles throughout the songs, but they never come off as, forced or out of place. It all feels very natural together. And right from the beginning of side 1, I'm just loving it when it opens up with All the Children Sing. I just think that's an absolute banger of an opening track. It's got really cool production, it's got a great drive to it, and it just sets a really nice mood for the album to continue off of. And then he follows that up with one of his most classic hits, Can We Still Be Friends? Everyone loves that song. And then it's followed by another great love song titled Hurting for You. And then on track 4, the vibe switches up a little bit with probably my favorite song on the album, Too Far Gone. I really love the vocal work. It has really amazing keyboard sounds, and it almost reminds me of a track that could have been on A Wizard, a True Star. So it's cool how we're, once again, hearing some little hints of previous albums in some of these songs. Then we have Onomatopoeia, which has much more of a goofy, comical sort of vibe to it. And once again, another song that sounds like it could have been on A Wizard, a True Star, or Todd from that psychedelic era. And after that, side 1 concludes with a track called Determination. And this is a really solid rocking track, a nice way to end side one. And this one has always kind of reminded me of a track that could have been on like a late 70s Utopia album. Just in terms of the vibe and the vocal harmonies, kind of has a Utopia sort of vibe to me. So it's cool to hear some of that coming out as well. And a great way to end the first side. And then on side two, we have another great diverse mix of tracks with the beautiful piano ballads, Bag Lady and Lucky Guy. Then we have the rocking tracks, You Cried Wolf, Out of Control, and Bread. Bread has sort of like a dark, mysterious 70s rock sort of vibe to it. And then the final track, Fade Away, I think is an absolutely perfect ending to the album. It has such a beautiful vocal melody, amazing lyrics, great production, and such a heartwarming, powerful way to conclude such an amazing album. So, like I said, I think it has a great blend of a lot of different styles of Todd, and all of the songs are just absolutely incredible. And I always come back to this one usually as my favorite. So I would say this is my favorite Todd Rundgren album, and this one easily gets an S. All right, next we have Healing from 1981. And at this point, this has been the longest gap we've had in between any of Todd's albums, with the Hermit of Mink being in 78. So this is almost a 3-year gap now, and we reach a point where me as a listener going through his discography, I'm very curious as to how his sound is going to adapt into the new 80s era. And when I first heard this album, I gotta say, I was very pleasantly surprised. I really love this album. This is another one that's an easy S for me. And this is actually one of the albums that flip-flops with Hermit of Mink for my favorite Todd album. So I would say this is easily in the top 3, if not top 2, at all times. I really love everything about this album. And I would say that this is the first album to really introduce us to the more electronic side of Todd Rundgren that becomes, much bigger of a part of his sound in future albums. And I really love that side of him. And this album has a nice blend of different moods and vibes throughout the songs, but it's all centered around a general message of spirituality and the human condition, and the idea of there being this figure that has the power to heal the world, and then wrestling with the question of whether or not that would be a good thing if somebody did have that power. And I just really love the way that he presents that message throughout the album. Side 1 is just filled with amazing tracks. And on side 2, I really love the 3-track healing segment, particularly part 1 and part 2. Just so amazing and so meditative to just listen to those two back to back. And then it brings you back into reality for part 3. It's just such an amazing journey that those 3 tracks take you through. And I also really love Time Heals. I think that's one of the most underrated 80s songs of all time. I think that should be like one of the top dance songs of the 80s. Other noteworthy songs for me are Compassion and the opening song Healer. And yeah, just all in all, another incredible album. One of my all-time favorite albums from the 80s as well. So another one that gets an easy S. Okay, now we continue with the ever-popular Tortured Artist Effect from 1982. And I'm going to give this one an A. This is a very good album, a nice change of pace from Healing. This one takes on more of a pop rock sound with some more of those electronic instruments being implemented. I really like the production on this one, and I think that Todd's production was really good throughout all of his career, but I really like the fact that it didn't really suffer in the 80s, because oftentimes for me with a lot of 80s music, I get very turned off by the production, but I've never had that happen with any of Todd's 80s material, so I gotta give credit where credit is due with the production style. So on this album, there are 9 songs, and the way that I've always felt about this album is that the first 6 tracks are like perfect, and then it kind of dies down a little bit at the end for me, and that's basically the main reason why I gave it an A instead of an S. The album opens up very strong with Hideaway, probably my favorite song on here. Such a beautiful way to open it up. And then we have a little bit of a change of pace on track 2 with Influenza, which is this more dark electronic pop rock sort of sound with these beautiful keyboards. And then track 3, we take a little bit more of a chill route with Don't Hurt Yourself, another one that's very heavy on the electronic keyboards. And then for track 4, the energy comes up a bit, and we have There Goes Your Baby, which is a really interesting contrast of sort of experimental electronic rock mixed with some more funky, soulful kind of vibes in the chorus. This song has always fascinated me. Love this song. And then we have Tin Soldier, which is actually a cover song, and I love the touch that this song adds to the album. It's got a really nice drive to it, and it almost reminds me of something that could have been on Something Anything. And then after that, we have Emperor of the Highway, which is a goofy piano track, sort of reminds me of another track that could have been on A Wizard, a True Star. So I love the combination of these new sounds that Todd is experimenting with, combined with a couple of tracks that are reminiscent of some previous albums. But after that, when we have the last three tracks, that's where the album sort of loses some momentum for me. I've never really been crazy about Bang on the Drum All Day, Drive, or Chant. Bang on the Drum All Day is really catchy, but it's not, I don't think, one of the more exciting Todd Rundgren tracks. But it's definitely a fun track. And then Drive and Chant, they've just kind of never really done much for me. So I would say that it's really an amazing album. I love the first 6 tracks, and then it kind of dies down a bit towards the end, which is the main reason why I dropped it down to an A. But still a great album, and I still love listening to the majority of the tracks on here. So, yep, that one gets an A. All right, next we have his 1985 album titled Acapella, and this one easily gets an S. When it comes to favorite Todd albums, I would say that my 3 that I kind of dance between are Hermit of Mink Hollow, Healing, and Acapella. So this one is very high for me. I absolutely love this album. It's very unique, very ambitious. It's an all-voice album consisting of vocal work as well as the sampling of Todd's voice to create different instrument sounds. And very cool of Todd to make an album so different from everything he's done up to this point. And this is kind of like a very clear moment where you can see that he's really just going to experiment in any way that he wants with his songwriting. And I think that's part of what his fans love about him so much, because you're really going on this amazing journey through his discography. We have a lot of different moods going on throughout the album. We have some upbeat poppy songs like Something to Fall Back On, Mighty Love, and Hoja. We have some sadder, more expressive tracks like Pretending to Care and Lost Horizon. We have some hard-hitting tracks like Blue Orpheus and Lockjaw. And we even have just an all a cappella track with Honest Work. So I love the contrast throughout the album, and I love the utilization of his voice and the amazing variety of sounds that they were able to implement in such a tasteful fashion. So amazing album and a very great surprising follow-up to the previous release. So this one easily gets an S. Next, we have the 1989 release, Nearly Human, and I'm going to give this one an A. I know a lot of people think that this is one of the best Todd albums, and this one has always been tricky with me because I really love 6 of the tracks on here, but then it has 4 that I've just never been able to get into for whatever reason. But the songs that I do like on here are just incredible. So it takes more of a pop rock sort of feel once again, and it has the addition of his future wife, Michelle Gray, and I really love the addition of her background vocals. I think stylistically it fits perfectly on this album. The 4 tracks that I can't get into are The Want of a Nail, Two Little Hitlers, Unloved Children, and I Love My Life. And I know people will disagree on that. You know, that's just me for whatever reason. One track that is really a standout for me, though, is Parallel Lines. I absolutely love that track, and it probably would make my top 5 favorite Todd Rundgren songs. So, you know, this album does have a lot of amazing tracks, but those 4, I've just never been able to get into them, and so that would knock it down 1 tier for me. So, great album. I'll give this one an A. After that, we have Second Wind from 1991, and this one is actually an album that was recorded in front of a live studio audience over the course of a week. So the audience is actually witnessing what goes into the process of making an album, which is very unique and a very original idea. And I'm going to give this one an A. I have a lot of similar thoughts that I had with Nearly Human that also apply to this album, where I really love the majority of the album, but it does have a couple of tracks here and there that kind of lose a little bit of momentum for me. But the tracks that I like, I think, are some of his strongest tracks from the 90s, like Change Myself, Love Science, Who's Sorry Now, If I Have to Be Alone, and the title track, Second Wind, which is probably my favorite song on the album. It's just so hard-hitting and so badass, and just such an epic way to end the album. The only part of the album that I'm not that crazy about is when they have some of those tracks that were from the musical Up Against It, with the exception of If I Have to Be Alone. I do love that song, but The Smell of Money and Love in Disguise, to me, just kind of brings the momentum down a little bit. But aside from the musical-esque stuff, I really think that this is an amazing album with a lot of really hard-hitting Todd Rundgren tracks from the 90s. So, great album. I'll give this one an A. All right, next we have the 1993 release, No World Order, which is the first of two albums credited to TRI, which stands for Todd Rundgren Interactive. And I'll give this one an A. Very unique and cool album, and a significant shift from Second Wind, and really probably the biggest shift from any previous album that he's made thus far. This was the first ever interactive CD released as a Philips CDI, which is a CD that you have the option of listening to as a regular album, or you can interact with the CD, and it has almost 1,000 different musical events that you can apparently manipulate. I've never owned a CDI player, so I'm not exactly sure about the inner workings of how all of that stuff is done, but that's incredibly innovative on Todd's part. And just another example of, like I was saying, how Todd Rundgren is always just full of surprises, and you never know what you're going to get when you're listening to his music. Stylistically, this album takes a big shift into a more electronic hip-hop style. And I gotta be honest, initially when I heard this album, I wasn't crazy about it, but then the more and more I listened to it, it started to grow on me. And I really love the production. The beats are really cool. I like the way that the songs weave in and out of each other. And you have the continuation of certain songs in longer forms throughout the album. And I'm sure, obviously, a huge part of the experience of this album is listening to it as the CDI. So I can only imagine how cool of an experience that would be as well. Some of my personal favorites on here are World Epiphany, Property, Time Stood Still, and No World Order 1.1. And getting my hands on one of these CDIs is definitely on my bucket list, because I would love to be able to experience the album with that interactive component. It just seems very fascinating. And yeah, great album. I'll give this one an A. Next, we have the second release of his TRI project called The Individualist from 1995. And I'm also going to give this one an A. Very solid album. It's got a great selection of tracks, and it also has the interactive component to it as well, with videos that accompany each song when you play it on a computer. And once again, I wish I was able to experience this album under those conditions, because it just seems fascinating. And this album is much different from No World Order, where on this one, the songs vary more stylistically, and there's only one track that features any sort of rapping in it. I think there's a great mix of different styles and different kinds of songs on here, with the mid-tempo rock songs like Tables Will Turn and Temporary Sanity, and then you have up-tempo, more driving, groovy songs like Espresso and Women's World. You have the amazing politically driven song Family Values, as well as the beautiful ballad The Ultimate Crime. So a lot of great songs and some great political commentary as well, similar to on No World Order, actually, as well. There was some good political commentary there, too. So another amazing album, another one that will get an A. Okay, next we have the 1997 release called Up Against It, which features songs that are demos written between 1986 and 1989 for a musical theater adaptation of the never-produced screenplay titled Up Against It. And I'm going to give this one a C, unfortunately. I've always had a hard time with this one. For me personally, I've just never been a huge musical person, so the music in this is hard for me to really get into when I'm listening to it, because a lot of the writing just tends to lend itself to more of a musical theater style for me, and that I've just had a hard time with that. Regardless of who is writing the music, I don't think that's something that is very easy for me to get into. So apologies to any musical theater fans out there, but just my opinion. But this one has just never stood out to me, so I'll give this one a C. Next, we have another release from 1997 called With a Twist, which is all remakes of older songs done in a bossa nova style. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to do a second C in a row. This album has never done much for me. I really do like the song choices that they made, and I think instrumentally, the songs work really well in a bossa nova style. But for whatever reason, on a lot of these songs, the way that Todd sings some of the vocal melodies sort of puts me off a bit. On a lot of these songs, he'll sing certain parts of the vocal melody like a beat earlier than it would normally come in. And you can hear that on I Saw the Light, Can We Still Be Friends, Never Neverland, and A Dream Goes On Forever. He doesn't do it for every single line, but when he does, it always kind of makes the timing feel sort of funny to me. And I think that if it wasn't for that specifically, I might put this album in B tier, because, like I said, instrumentally, I really like what's going on here, but I'm not always crazy about the vocal phrasing. And it's an album of remakes, so it doesn't carry the same weight that the previous albums do just by default. So yeah, I'll give this one a C. Next, we have One Long Year from 2000, and this is an album that was initially only released to people who subscribed to a website Todd created called Patronet. And I'm going to give this one a B. Not a bad album, but I wouldn't say it's one of the stronger works. It's got a handful of really good tracks sandwiched in between some less exciting tracks, in my opinion. And I feel like the track listing and the styles are kind of all over the place, particularly with Bang on the Ukulele All Day and then the bossa nova version of Love of the Common Man, which always sounded to me like something that could have just been on the previous album with a twist. Not a bad song, but in the context of the album, it's always seemed a little bit random to me and kind of creates this scattered vibe. We do have some really cool tracks, though, like Buffalo Grass, You're Fast, and my personal favorite, Where Does the Time Go? Absolutely beautiful song. And you're definitely still hearing Todd's sound evolve more in some of these original songs, with some of the songs taking more of an experimental electronic route with tracks like Jerk and Mary and the Holy Ghost, which I think starts to set the stage for the next album, Liars. So in my opinion, we're getting little hints of what's to come in the next release. So not a bad album, but not amazing at the same time. So I'll give this one a B. Now we go to the incredible 2004 album titled Liars, and this one easily gets an S, an absolute masterpiece of an album, and I think this was his best work in over 20 years up to this point. It takes on much more of an experimental electronic pop rock sort of feel, with a consistent theme throughout the album about seeking truth and spiritually seeking the answers to the mysteries of life. And the album sets that tone with the incredible opening track titled Truth. Right from the beginning, I'm just loving it. It has these really cool rhythmic synth samples that give me hints of A Wizard, a True Star, and Todd. And as the album continues, it has a great combination of different kinds of songs with different vibes. We have some more groovy tracks like Sweet, Soul Brother, Stood Up, and Flow. And then you have some more spacey, euphoric tracks like Future, Afterlife, and God Said. And you have a nice handful of driving, hard-hitting tracks as well, like Mammon, Living, and Liar. And while I really love this whole album, I will say that for me, the momentum really picks up from Future to the end of the album. I feel like the beginning 6 songs are kind of like an appetizer that just brings everything in really nicely. And then when Future comes in, I think the album just completely kicks into overdrive. So many great songs. And for me, a couple of standout tracks for the first half, my 2 favorites are Truth and Stood Up. And for the second half, I really love Future, Afterlife, and God Said. It's kind of a tie between those 3. They're all just so amazing. And it's really astonishing to me that after almost 40 years of making albums up to this point, Todd is still capable of producing such high quality albums like this. So incredible release, his best album of the 2000s in my opinion. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, now we will continue with the 2008 album titled Arena. And unfortunately, I'm going to give this one another C. I've always had a hard time with this album. This is his most guitar-heavy album that he's done in a long time, so stylistically, it's much more of a hard-hitting rock album, very different from Liars, not very much electronic stuff going on. And I do appreciate that it showcases his guitar playing more, but unfortunately, I've never really resonated with the majority of the songs on this album. Maybe I need to listen to it more. I've listened a few times, and each time was pretty much the same experience. Nothing really clicked or changed with any of the tracks. The couple of good moments that I do enjoy on here, I think Mercenary is a really badass, hard-hitting song. And I really love Courage. Courage is easily the high point of the album for me. That's a really beautiful track. And I also don't mind Bardo. That's a pretty unique song as well. But other than that, I've really never been crazy about the other 10 tracks on here, which is unfortunate because I did have high hopes for this album and I really wanted to like it, but it's just never done it for me. So I'm going to give this one a C. All right, next we have a Robert Johnson tribute album from 2011 with the humorous title Todd Rundgren's Johnson. And I'm also going to give this one a C, unfortunately. Never been crazy about this album. I appreciate that we're hearing Todd's guitar playing more and we're hearing some of his roots, but I've just never been crazy about the song choices or the styles that the songs are done in. I was hoping for more of a raw, down and dirty blues album, and there are a couple of tracks like that on here, but it almost feels like a hard rock album, and if I didn't know from the title, I wouldn't have even known that a lot of these songs are classic Robert Johnson songs. So not one of my favorites, unfortunately. I'll give this one a C. All right, next we have another album from 2011 called Reproduction, and this is an album of cover songs from a variety of different albums that he had produced over the years. And I'm going to give this one a B. I really like this album. I think it's very fun and adventurous, and it has a lot of really interesting takes of the songs that he covers. It's basically the complete opposite of Faithful, because with Faithful, the intention was to do the covers as close to the originals as possible, and this album pretty much feels like the complete opposite. I love his take on the songs that he chooses, and in a lot of cases, I actually like his versions better than some of the originals, particularly with 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad, Personality Crisis, and especially with the Cheap Trick cover of I Can't Take It. His chorus on that one just brings out a whole nother layer of intensity that I don't get in the original version. The chorus of that song is a high point on the album for me. I think it's so beautiful. And as far as critiques, my main critique of the album would just be that I would say I think it's a little too long. I think you could have taken out 4 to 5 songs and it would have been totally fine. But regardless, I do find this album really enjoyable, but it's also all covers, so I think that will naturally knock it down a tier for me, but not a bad album at all. I'll give it a B. Okay, next we have State from 2013, and this is probably going to be my one take that surprises some people, but I'm actually going to give this an S. I absolutely love this album, and I know a lot of people don't, but I think if you listen to it a few more times, it might grow on you, because when I first heard it, I thought it was pretty good, but I wasn't blown away. But then the more I listened to it, the more and more it grew on me. And I've always thought that if you really like the Liars album, then I think there has to be at least something for you on here, because I think stylistically, they're very similar. I wouldn't say that this album is as good as Liars. I think it's a slight downgrade from that, but I do think the songwriting, the production, the electronic nature of it, I think it just has a lot of similarities to Liars, and maybe you could call this like a darker version of Liars, and maybe that's why it turns off some people. It opens up with this intense 8-minute track called Imagination, and I absolutely love the tone that this song sets for the album. Really cool dark guitar parts and a really awesome vocal melody. And then throughout the album, we have these beautiful euphoric electronic tracks like Smoke, Something from Nothing, and Surreality, mixed in with a couple more upbeat, groovy tracks with Serious and Party Liquor. And then we have some more darker, mysterious tracks like Imagination, Angry Bird, and Kaleidoscope. My personal favorites on here are Something from Nothing and Kaleidoscope, both very solid, unique, just original sounding songs. And I particularly love the section that features Rachel Hayden on Something from Nothing, just so beautiful. So all in all, I love the selection of tracks on here. I love the vibe throughout the album. I don't think this album has a bad song. Very euphoric and atmospheric, and easily one of my favorite later Todd albums. So this one will also get an S. Next, we have the 2015 release, Global, and I'll give this one a B. Not a bad album, but not one of my favorites. I always have considered this to be a more sort of upbeat continuation off of State. When you listen to both albums, stylistically, they're very similar in the sense that they're both very electronic. But in terms of the moods of each album, State is much darker, and I would say that this is kind of like the more upbeat counterpart to State. This album does have some cool moments for sure, but unfortunately for me, there are a lot of tracks in between those moments that really don't do much for me and kind of have the album lose a little bit of momentum. Some of these moments that I really like the chorus of Flesh and Blood. Global Nation is a cool track. Terra Firma is very cool and reminds me of something that could have been on State. Skyscraper is really catchy. Technopolis definitely has a lot of cool electronic stuff going on. And Soothe is so beautiful, and that's my favorite track on the album by far. Always loved that track. So there are definitely good moments, but unfortunately, beyond the stuff that I just listed, I've never been that crazy about the remainder of the album, so I'll give this one a B. Okay, this next one, I'm not sure if it's considered a Todd Rundgren solo album or not. Some people lean more towards a collaboration, but on Wikipedia it was listed under his solo albums. Certain websites list it like that, so I just figured I would include it just in case. And apologies if I pronounced the title wrong. I've never heard somebody say it, but I believe it's called Rundons from 2015, and I'm going to give this one a B. So like I said, this album is a collaboration, and I believe it was all recorded virtually between Todd and then two Norwegian musicians, Hans Peter Lindstrom and Emil Nicolaisen. It's a big change of pace from all of the recent Todd Rundgren albums. It's very electronic and extremely experimental. I would probably say it's the most experimental album that he's ever done. And while I do like what's going on here and I appreciate the continued evolution of Todd's sound, this is definitely an album that I have to be in a specific mood to listen to, kind of like what I said about Initiation. With Initiation, though, you do have the first side of less experimental music, and then the second side is kind of like the experimental blowout, whereas with this album, it kind of feels like the entire album is like that blowout. So there's nothing wrong with that, and I really do like a lot of it, and I think there's great stuff going on. I wouldn't say that this album has the same replay value for me as like a Hermit of Mink Hollow or Something Anything or so many of the other albums that we've already discussed. But regardless, I do think that there's a lot of great stuff going on throughout the album, so I'll give this one a B. All right, and last but not least, we have Todd's most recent release from 2017 titled White Night. And I'm also going to give this one a B. Not a bad album, but to me, this one feels the most like a collaboration album all the way through. It has by far the most guest features of any of Todd's albums, and it only has 3 songs that don't feature any guests at all. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but to me, there are definitely some tracks on here that don't really feel like Todd Rundgren's music, but then at the same time, there are some great moments and great collaborations as well. Like, I really love I Got Your Back, Naked and Afraid, Fiction, Let's Do This, and Wouldn't You Like to Know. The guitar on Wouldn't You Like to Know is particularly interesting. It almost has like a math rock sort of vibe to it, which I believe is played by Todd's son, Rebop. So I like that. I thought that was a very nice surprise. I also really like the collaboration with Donald Fagen. I think that is a powerhouse duo, to say the least. And yeah, so I guess I would say I'm not crazy about a good handful of the songs on here, but the moments that are good are really good, and there are some really solid collaborations and a handful of really good tracks. So I'll give this one a B. All right, so that is it. We covered all 26 albums and went over a ton of information. So if I misspoke anywhere or said anything incorrect, like I said, please correct me in the comments and I'll fix it. But if you're a music listener and you're looking for a new artist to go through their discography, Todd Rundgren will offer you a very unique and exciting journey that I really haven't heard from very many other artists in my life. And one of the most profound things that I've ever heard Todd say that I think perfectly encapsulates his philosophy was that he was talking about how he had developed a fan base that follows him with whatever he does. And he said that in his mind, the whole point of achieving that kind of success is that so you can buy yourself freedom rather than more limitations. And I think when you look at his catalog and you look at how his sound has consistently evolved over the years, it's very apparent that he's a completely musically free artist that is really doing everything on his own terms and taking the listener along for the journey. And I just think going through all of his albums has been one of the most enjoyable and rewarding musical listens I've ever experienced. So thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making it. And if you'd like to, feel free to check out my other tier lists in the description. And please let me know where you agree, where you disagree, and if you have any recommendations of any other albums you think I'd enjoy or artists, please feel free to shoot them in the comments. I would appreciate it. All right, that's it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next video. Take care.